Contario. I'm the Vice President of Payment Sales at FastPay. I have the pleasure of moderating this session today, which was put together in partnership with Workamajig, but by my colleague, Grant Duggars. So I just want to, basically say that, FastPay is honored to have such a great partner in Workamajig, and I really appreciate everyone who came out for the webinar today. So let me introduce our panelists. David, when you join, just shout and I'll back up and let you do any other intros or business that you might need to do. But let me introduce our panelists who we have some powerhouses from the media ad agency side, and also, if I put the math together, it's somewhat of a combined 80 plus years of ad agency experience on this call, so that's fantastic. David Arnold, who I said will join, he's an account manager at Workamajig. He is a self-proclaimed grand poobah of Workamajig, helping to create content and continuing education.
I don't know about self-proclaimed.
Well, okay. Well, I was going to ask you, are you self-proclaimed, or does everyone at Workamajig call you Grand Poobah?
I'm the one with the longest teeth, I guess.
Yeah. And so David, do you want to kick this off, or do you want me to continue?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Well.
Yeah, so David here is, he creates the continuing education materials, assists customers in getting the most out of their software and project management tool, Workamajig. And also starting with Zach Rosenberg on the consultant side. He is a growth and search consultant at Zach Rosenberg Consulting. He came directly and recently from the agency business. He assists marketers, advertisers, procurement professionals with agency search and selection. And he also has a customer service focus, again, on the media agency side, and works mostly with brands to help them find the right partner. So make sure you're jotting his name down if you're trying to get in with some new business development for some new brands. And then Vince Dong is with us. He is also a CPA and an advice, gives advice on software and consulting. He's an agency consultant with 35 plus years experience. He's also, like I said, a CPA and helps agencies develop data-driven actionable plans. He consults with agencies on operations, finance, software tools, and generally helps agencies be more efficient, which we'll learn doesn't have to mean just make more money. That could also be making smarter money, right, Vince? And maybe we'll kind of kick things off there. We all sort of touched on it in some of our preliminary calls here about, and we'll dive into a little bit more about what you and Zach specifically do. And then David will round it out with some more of the operations and project management tools that, agencies can use to help them be more efficient. So Vince, in our pre-panel call, you mentioned how agencies can work smarter by using data. Can you describe your experience in helping agencies learn what they're good at, or simply track to a larger goal? Do they want new clients? Do they want to learn where their inefficiencies are so they can fix them? Can you just give a little bit about what you do and how that works?
Well, I do work a lot with Workamajig, and I incidentally am one of their 8 consultants in North America. And I don't talk a lot about balance sheet or income statements because the person that's preparing that data better already know how to prepare that information. It's the management data, it's the project data, it's the client data that agencies really ought to focus on from an intelligence standpoint. And I look at something so simple as firing a gun. You're typically going to use the scope or look down that barrel and go, I'm going to knock off that tin can, as opposed to just blindly shooting your gun and hoping that you can take out that tin can. But with the data that's available, you can certainly know where you are losing money like crazy, who's not being efficient, where you are making money like crazy, what kind of work you are doing to do what you're doing, in order for you, and Zach will jump in a moment, to see where you are going to best spend your time productively, as opposed to pouring it down the drain. Without that data, you're pouring your time down the drain.
Yep. And just, anecdotally, you kind of found your niche here because you come from the agency side as well, and you saw many agencies kind of making some common mistakes and decided to build a business off of that.
I'm grateful for being in this industry 35 years, having worked at an agency and wearing 3 heads today, an operations head, a finance and accounting head, and a software head. And David will probably acknowledge this. I'm very, very direct, and clients don't have time to waste time. So when they need an answer, I'm not one to give them 4 or 5 options. I will certainly say the right answer or the correct answer to go in this direction, or to decide upon that new opportunity is blank. Right. I'm really, really grateful for the years that I've spent in this industry.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And Zach, I'll turn to you. These agency inefficiencies we talked about sort of show themselves pretty obviously to an agency veteran like you. And so, when brands are going through their reviews, it's going to be important that an agency really, I think we talked about the concept of know themselves, right? So what are some deficiencies that can kind of show up in the agency review process? And also feel free to give a little bit more about your background and how you kind of, pigeonholed yourself into this niche for the industry.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. Happy to be here. I've been in the agency world for 40 years, which is really pretty scary. I grew up client service at full service agencies, spending a great amount of time at Chi-Day, where, we were reinventing the future even back then. I did a very unusual pivot about 25 years ago, and I moved from full service to media only agency. And that was before unbundling occurred, so it was a very unpopular move. I left, coming out of creating the virtual office at Chi-Day to a allegedly stodgy media shop that had a perception that they just bought bulk and it wasn't strategic, but it was a chance to manage Disney business, and it was a very profound experience that, has affected my career to this day. But working in, agencies like Horizon Media for 15 years, we went from $500 million to $6 billion over that time. Growth was meteoric, and we completely changed everything and invented things, and it was just profound. And so a culmination of all those experiences, on top of the fact that I've always been a big networker, right? Because new business has always been part of my job as someone who manages clients. And so I learned early on that networking can pay off dividends down the road. And so I launched my consultancy just a few years ago with the desire to share my wisdom, to tap into my network, and to help clients solve problems, whatever they are. So I have a couple pillars of what I do. One is I do agency search, which you brought up. And that is when, CMOs are looking to identify a new media agency. And there are typically a number of pain points that trigger reviews. And a lot of it has to do with quality of service, right? It's all about client service. It goes back to that at the end of the day. But really, their capabilities, the depth of capabilities, their ability to drive insights through data, and their buying cloud, which has become a little bit commoditized. That's probably a discussion.
Okay.
So that's kind of one part of it. The other is I do a lot of growth work. I work with companies and agencies to help them grow because everyone's looking for business.
Perfect. Yeah, and we kind of talked a little bit about how, again, when you're in these reviews, things start to become pretty obvious from the agency side. And so I definitely want to, make a nod towards our audience here, who are probably mostly independent agencies and creative shops, where, there could be a lot of competition, and the brands could be looking for some, additional experience that, an agency may or may not have. And again, it's, that experience and being able to, that experience on your end coming from the agency side and being able to kind of identify these are the roads that a brand could drive down. I think that's what some of the folks in our audience might want to learn a little bit more from you, how they can kind of stand out in that process.
Well,
yep, go
want me
ahead.
to jump into that now, or do you want to navigate?
Yeah, why not? Yes.
So I think the first part is that you need visibility in order to get the attention of search consultants to be invited to review. So in these reviews I've done, I've had some moments where I've realized it confirms how I used to behave on the agency side. But it's really important that you have a strong client lead in the review. You could have great strategic work, but if the client does not have confidence in the client lead that you're serving up, you're dead in the water. Because you could fix strategy, you can't fix chemistry. So I can't diminish the importance of chemistry in these review process. Buying has been somewhat commoditized. The role of data and analytics is truly important. A lot of agencies are leaning heavily into that, not only to inform media strategy, but to inform creative strategy. And that's a fairly new development because, a lot of creative directors don't like dealing in data. It becomes a little more, a less kind of touchy-feely, but using data to inform creative strategies become very important in the mix. So those are just a couple tips that have come out, a couple insights that have come out in the reviews that I've done.
Yeah, that's great. And I think we'll touch on this and come back to this common thread of, what are we if we're not a relationship driven as a larger industry anyway, right? That's our job, is to connect with our ultimate advertiser or our consumers. So, that's how, no surprise, this industry works too. I want to get into a little bit of the market, which I think is a good, follow up next. Again, also continuing down this same path of, it's important that the agency knows itself and ways to do that. But let's back up and talk a little bit about the market. So are we seeing more or less reviews, and why do we think that is? I'll throw it out to either of you, but Zach, you might want to kick it off, and then I'll pass it to you, Vince, and see, what you think is going on out there.
Yeah, thanks. Review activity has been pretty wild. I mean, it's fueled by CMO turnover, which is continuing. However, there are some recessionary fears. We're getting into fourth quarter where a lot of clients are kind of just retrenching and making plans for next year. And doing a review, by the way, what I've learned in conducting reviews is they are extremely labor intensive, because I'm dealing with the client on a daily basis, and I'm dealing with the agencies, whether it's 10 or 12 to start, down to 6, down to finalists of 3. There's a lot involved that the client has to manage, and they don't have the time. So I think we're seeing a slowdown of reviews at this very moment, but I believe that's temporary. And what's ironic is that you see a slowdown, yet you continue to see CMO turnover. So I think what that means is there's going to be a lag where we're going to start to see renewed activity with regard to reviews, probably more after the first of the year.
Right. And you mentioned in our pre-panel call that usually a CMO, when CMO turnover occurs, usually an agency review is quick to follow because they're kind of making some quick changes, but you're seeing more of CMO turnover but hunkering down, or making some slower no drama, right? Making some slower moves and changes first and kind of feeling things out.
Yeah, I mean, let's kind of get through fourth quarter. Let's wrap things up. Let's get our house in order, and then boom, out the gate, it could come back strong.
Yeah. And then Vince, can you talk about agency reviews from your perspective? And then I kind of want to weave in, a need for more specialized agencies, generalized agencies into that as well.
Well, certainly, if you've got a generic agency versus, let's say, a healthcare agency that just eats, breathes, and sleeps healthcare all day long, the generic agency will tend to take a look at an entire spectrum of opportunities and not be, and I'll say this, not be wise about the way in which they're going after work. If you've got a specialty, be it IT or let's say hospitality, then you already know what you know. You've got the right people in place. You can actually save a great deal of time going after like or similar work to essentially be more efficient about it. And I'll cite data as another example. We have this client that monitors their write-offs by multiple categories. And strangely enough, their biggest write-off category is investments of opportunities. And what they do is they critically analyze and assess, so where did we blow our brains out on a particular opportunity that we didn't get versus where we were minimalistic on a whole pile of time on an opportunity that we did get. So it's where I'm looking at this more and more and more so is particularly the operations people and the finance people now have some of an arsenal to present to the new business team to say, guys, here's what we have found in the last year or two, and just be mindful of when you move forward with this kind of a perhaps $50,000 opportunity, and it's 250 grand of labor time that you have to spend. Is that the wisest use of your time moving forward? And the comma is, notwithstanding how I watched the stock market take a great big dive last week in the last 6 months, people are not so confident about themselves right now. And as Zach mentioned it, they're being a little bit more cautious in getting their housekeeping done before the end of the year. What I can say is we're all unsure, but if we stay true to our school and continue to do well, great. The wild card, Teresa, is staff. And perhaps this recession might settle some people down so that the agency in question that's doing a pitch will have greater confidence that the pitch team is going to be around in the new year. The last thing you want to do is have freelancers doing this, and they're gone off to some other new position, and you win the piece of business through Zach, and then you go to yourself, well, how are we going to service this? And so this is what I have to look forward to in the next 3 months and 6 months. What is it going to look like commencing in January?
Yeah, and I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the agency is weathering a lot of change since even 2020, right? Like, we're still all like getting used to, our new identity under, remote working conditions, and, probably a big change in the way that, culture is even shared among folks, et cetera, which I know on the agency side, that's a big deal. So I think you're totally right. Like, not only are agencies trying to get a grip on what am I good at? What was I good at? Is that still what I want to be good at? Right? There needs to be some self-reflection maybe to help.
Yeah, Teresa, I might add, what a wonderful time, if you're not as an agency taking a look at your own data, to really dig into the data, particularly if you've got a really clean database and you've not really given any thought to that aspect of it. And if you are on a wonderful program, and David, I'm not tooting your horn by any stretch, I do a lot of work with Workamajig clients, and the available data that's in there, just so long as you know what you're looking for, is tremendous.
Yeah. Well, wait, let's stop on that point really quick, because I was going to say, clean database, what does that mean? Can you give us a little bit more of an understanding? Like, is that my CRM, or is that just my hours logged working on a project, et cetera? Like, what is that for any agency customer to think about?
Wow, have you got 2 days?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I'm a big fan of making sure that the 6 key balance sheet accounts tick and tie, reconcile, make sense, and I'll just quickly mention them before I have David jump in as well. But I've run into clients that their bank reconciliations are not done. They've not cross-referenced their accounts receivable to their subledgers. They've not cross-referenced their payables to the subledgers. They barely pay attention to the deferred revenue. So many agencies that are on Workamajig do not use work in process. I'm a huge fan of unbilled time, unbilled production costs, unbilled media, unbilled miscellaneous expenses. If you don't use work in process, you can have gobs and gobs of time not billed, and you don't have an idea of how old that time is in the meantime. And then in terms of data, my 2 key reports are client P&Ls and employee utilization reports. I mean, again, I could go on for 2 days. Mr.
Yeah.
Arnold, you want to add to that?
Yeah, as far as like a clean database, I think it's just, again, getting your ducks in a row. Maybe sometimes it's at the beginning, you're a little sketchy on what to do. You know, our system is set up for agencies, so we kind of put those defaults in for you. And then it's a matter of, you know, what's your guru saying? And a lot of times we can form or create connections or reports that would provide you with whatever your guru is asking you to do. But again, we see people tracking WIP. The other side of that is even just saying, you know, we're going to do a $10,000 media buy. Well, we'll put in an advance bill. Right? We call it an advance bill. It's basically saying, give me money up front and I'll spend it and I'll let you know how we're spending it. But, you know, give me the money up front. And just tracking that may be, you know, another way of looking at maybe WIP, because again, at that time, I worked an hour, I can kind of recognize an hour's worth of work at the end of the day or at the end of the month.
Right. Right.
But
So
yeah, just having, you know, clean database equals, you know, just making sure you have it kind of set up and tracking in the proper way. What labor categories are you using? What expenses would you have, and track that way.
right. So I'm also hearing, you know, it's basically just knowing the business of your business and tracking that business, and then having tools out there besides spreadsheets or other things, tools out there that can help you to quickly find that information and data and then take an assessment of that.
Teresa, I should add a couple of other things. Well, really one major thing, and David's run into this in the past. I'm a huge fan of making sure that you have the right bum in the seat. And if somebody that really doesn't understand data, let alone project management or accounting, and they start asking David rudimentary questions, poor David, he can't say to the person, Vince, you're not the right bum in the seat when you're supposed to be responsible for the gathering, the analyses, the presentation of this invaluable data. And there's where David is stuck. So moving forward, if you've got the right bum in the seat, then it's the trifecta of making sure that you've got correct data, making sure that you've got somebody that understands the data and somebody that can interpretate the data, because that person, I do deal with a controller who is quite now the orator of being able to take this, let's call it financial data or project management data, and then translate it to the owner of the company in a language that the owner understands. So it's not a matter of just 1 + 1 = 2. It is equally important for that person to be able to communicate within a communications agency for that kind of line of sight.
Right. That makes sense. There. I mean, you know, you can't make progress if you haven't sort of tracked these things. So, so that makes sense. And I also, you know, heard you touch on some idea of confidence and courage, right? And I think on the agency side, you have to know your business before you want to go after other business. But I mean, is it possible that agencies, you know, they get excited about the new piece of business and the new opportunity, and their creative juices get flowing, right? It's not something they're working on every single day. I find that sort of inspires folks, so they sort of like chase the next best thing incessantly. So, I think maybe some of that information can kind of come to light as you're assessing the business of the business.
Yeah, and for that person in question, it's equally important for that person to say, well, if we're going to take on this piece of business and they've got a ton of media, for example, right, and the commission request or the commission demand is not going to be anywhere near 15 points, it would be incumbent upon that operations person or that finance person to say, how else could we make money on this piece of business while keeping up the level of quality of service? And I wonder if there's a vendor out there that could help us with punching through payables and quite possibly helping the bottom line accordingly for rebates, et cetera. I'm not putting a plug into your organization, but I come back to the overarching issue of agencies are constantly being attacked by clients by hearing them say, you're too much money. Can you do this for cheaper? We want all of your top staff, but we're not going to be paying for your top staff. Zach, I'm sure you've never heard this.
If I could jump in on that.
Yeah, please do.
It's been a chronic issue in our industry, and staffing is the biggest pain because it's very big expense. And of course, media is the largest marketing expense. So when clients are looking to save money, they go to the media budget. I mean, I hear it over and over every decade. I think it's a broken record. And the problem we're having is that, as fees are squeezed, staffing costs go up, you put more junior people on accounts, the quality of service diminishes. It's a classic spiral, and I don't know how we're going to dig out of it. I think that also speaks to, building an incentive performance compensation to try to make some money on the back end to offset that expense. But I want to tell you one anecdote that I've seen in these reviews of late, and I find it very funny. When agencies present to the client, they have a very large team, whether it's in person or on Zoom. And you're talking a ton of people, and the majority of them don't really speak. And there's only a few who do. And what I've learned and what I've seen is that, agencies will parade a large team of people to client meetings. And then the strategy there is, a month from now, some of those people will be gone. Over time, more people will leave. And you hope by the end of that 6 months or a year, there's a couple people left for continuity. And that's what happens. So they parade a ton of people. So if people leave, at least there's somebody who has that history. It's crazy. But the advice really in these presentations, less is more.
Okay, and kind of back to the sort of staffing or rates, or even back to talent right now as being an industry or an agency issue. A lot of agencies haven't adjusted their rates, right? I think they're paying more for people than they ever have, and then they're also, getting squeezed, like you said, from the brands, or in order to win the business. And I think one thing that you talk about is it worth it to go after a piece of business that you might lose money on? If it gets the agency exposure to a new sector, but how much money, can an agency handle in losing? Or can you talk a little bit more about like the risk they should or could take there?
No, that's a perpetual battle. I mean, yeah. You have to, if you set up criteria up front as to what's a good prospect, what isn't, that might help you filter out the ones that don't look good. But if you have an opportunity in a category that you're not active in and you want to break that category, that's a way to do it. There's the other strategy of some agencies go after everything. They publicize everything. It's all about visibility. And, the perception is that's an agency on the move. They're growing. So some will take lost leaders just to have that ability to publicize an account win. But on the other hand, it supports the staff that you have in a sense. Not only does it work them hard for all these pitches, but it shows that these people work at an agency that's growing and not, contracting. So there's a lot of kind of peripheral benefits, and it's the toughest thing to walk away from a prospect. You really have to determine, do you have a shot?
And it depends. It depends on the brand, right? It depends on the brand and what they're, looking for really. Like, is category expertise, that important, right? Or are the people, again, the relationships you're going to have with that agency or their other work going to be able to translate? I mean, we talked about how an agency needs to sort of know itself, should they focus on some more core capabilities or expand to different verticals, if you will?
And, also when you have a team of buyers across different channels, then is that an account if you win? Do you have to add people to your activation side, or does that just get absorbed? So really your only investment might be client service and strategy. So there's so many factors that go into it, and it's really difficult. And the problem is when you talk about a loss leader or a client that's not profitable, it's tough to go back to a client and ask for more money. But if you have a really good working relationship, you have to try. And if it's a really good client, they're going to look at that and say, I understand, I am underpaying you, and I'm not, I want that value, so I'm willing to find a way to pay you more money or to figure something out. And that's a sign of a great client.
Well, and I think that's a sign of a great client relationship, and then also goes back to some of the stuff you were talking about, Vince. Like, if you can go with the information of, this is why I'm charging you more, right? Just rather than just, we're going to increase by 20% blanket, right? There's got to be a better discussion there than just more.
And I'm right back to the software and the program itself, Teresa. So many times I've walked into agencies, and let's say that the blended rate is $175 an hour, and the agency principals go, well, these clients, we only realized $125 an hour or $135 an hour. And I ask them to spin it around and go, you track your company's profit directly relating to how much you earned and how much you paid out. And you ought to consider doing exactly the same thing, because to me, it's more dramatic for somebody to tell me, I only realized $110 an hour on this client when I should be billing $175 is one thing. If you told me, Teresa, that I lost $75,000 this year on this piece of business, I'd sit up and pay attention and go, oh, and to Zach's point, if we haven't drawn a line in the sand to say we ought to earn no less than 20% profit, net profit on a per client basis, and if we have 16 clients underwater, why aren't we asking ourselves the question, what on earth is going on here? And again, to Zach's point and your point about working more closely to clients, what a wonderful time to get a hold of your own data to see whether you're above or below your minimum profit threshold that you ought to have going into the new year. Yeah, a huge issue this particular year. I've seen agencies give their staff walloping salary increases. Strangely enough, it's not the easiest thing to get a client to pay walloping fee increases. So you've got that bit of a transition, which brings me back to, I'm looking very forward to seeing what happens Jan, Feb, and March with agencies. So the data, and I keep coming back to this, the more you understand your own house, the more you will be specific about the work you go after. I for one, and to Zach's point, am a huge fan of going after new business. And the minute you stop going after new business, you may as well start calling yourself a not-for-profit organization. So why not go after it more intelligently is my point.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I liked the concept of the client P&Ls. I haven't experienced many customers doing that, but it is like, that is literally what you should be doing, on a quarterly basis at the minimum, right?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Right. Yep.
But Teresa, the other point to this, which we haven't talked about, is you may be faced with resigning clients that are not profitable. And, culturally, agencies hate to resign clients because it's not in our nature. but you may have to make some hard decisions to resign those clients that are either not treating you well or they're a complete, loss of revenue.
Right.
And it's also healthy because the people that work on those accounts may not feel, good about it. And if you take that bad piece of business off their plate, they're going to feel better.
Right. Right. That probably stems back to some of the talent and staffing issues too, right? Again, the people who sort of won the business and were excited to work on this business because they won it, they may leave, and then you have a new regime that kind of takes it over, and it's sort of like you're, again, it takes the creativity or the emotion out of the business for some of those folks too, which I think definitely impacts the work, the quality of work, as well as, like you said, the sort of rate adjustment leading to some of the staffing decisions of that account.
But it all goes back to client service at the end of the day. That is everything. And interestingly, after unbundling back in the 90s, a lot of agencies eliminated that client role completely. And they made their media planner strategists become that client lead. Not
Right.
all planners become great client leads.
Yeah.
So quality of service diminished, and so now agencies are reinvesting in service, but that's a big line item. So, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You want quality client service to make sure you keep your clients and grow them.
Right.
If you compromise that, then you're not going to keep your clients. It's a really tough
Right.
place to be. But at the end of the day, client service is everything.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of does help me segue into, there's a lot of competition out there. And there's also, how do agencies better position themselves against maybe folks who have that vertical expertise, or holding companies, right? I mean, when you're talking about customer service, you have a ton of people under holding companies, but the independent agencies can give you could give you some more quality. I mean, can we talk a little bit about, I would imagine again, the majority of the folks on the line look like they are independent agencies. So let's talk a little bit how to compete with holding companies.
I'll bring up the elephant client. A lot of agencies who are independent rely 50, 60, 70% on one particular client, whether they are order taking with a client, whether they are consciously aware of just knocking down the door of one department, et cetera, et cetera. I've got one client who has 20 separate clients under the same umbrella of the corporate holding company. And on one hand, they are stressed because each year there's a higher percentage of revenue relative to the rest of their clients. On the other hand, they are seeing some level of a consolidation with this client in question, because these large clients also don't rely on just one agency. So in both instances, I said to the clients, why don't you get an employee and plant that person right into the offices of your client so that they are right there. Now, pre-2019, it was a lot easier. And post-2022, you can still have that employee in the hallways or close to the corporation itself, so that they are getting the feeling that you're invested. In fact, you're so invested, you're planting one of your own employees into the client's office. And that way, they are always not so much picking up the scraps, but a lot closer in terms of connecting with, and let's say they are made aware of some guy by the name of Zach Rosenberg who's going to take this entire account out for pitch, be much more aware a lot faster, and also move proactively. So that's one thought that I immediately had in terms of switching up, making more attentive your agency as a whole going into the new year.
Right. And that goes along with, that should be more manageable now that, remote working is more accommodated throughout agencies, right? So it has been proven that can happen. I know even back when I was on the agency side, one of the tactics was definitely to implant our staff there at the client. So for sure, I think that's something, and that was a holding company sub-agencies. So that's definitely a strategy they can deploy quickly. Is that something can you spare a person when you are a more independent or smaller shop?
If I could add to that, Teresa,
Please.
There are clients that need different models of agencies to start, right? There are large clients that need that global footprint that only a holding company can manage. There are clients that want independent agencies. They want best in class. They want media only, creative only, etc. There is a trend, by the way, of rebundling, which is really interesting because
of what?
Everything is rebundling. And what I mean by that, here's what's happened. I experienced it. So I have clients, maybe their budgets are under 50 million, right? Their teams are tight, especially coming out of COVID. They're lean just like agencies. And they don't want to brief multiple agencies. It's too much work. I had a client years ago where they had media, creative, PR, social, search, all separate agencies. They would throw all of us in a room and they would brief everybody at once. They didn't have the bandwidth to manage them separately. And they kind of yearned for the idea of finding a bundled solution so it's a one-stop shop. So I'm sensing this notion of rebundling where these clients, particularly the smaller ones, they're looking for a fully integrated solution, one-stop shopping that's easier on their bandwidth and workload.
Right.
And so there's been some talk in the trades about how full-service agencies are making a comeback. But what I'm also seeing is there's a lot of creative agencies that are building out a media practice. And they're doing that because clients will say to them, you're doing my creative work, you're doing my strategy work. Can't you just do my media for me? You would make my life so much simpler. So they're building out a media practice, which, they should because it's great revenue and it's more predictable revenue when a lot of creative work is more project-based. So I'm seeing a lot of creative shops building out a media practice, and this notion of rebundling is a real thing.
David, I'll call on you for that too. I mean, you're hand in hand with a lot of more or less project management for creative shops. So are you seeing the trend as well that more creative shops are starting to take on all services?
Yeah, there is this kind of, or they're just a smaller agency and then they're teaming up with other ones. They're bringing others in. So we'll see that type of thing.
Like a white labeling situation. The brand
exactly.
doesn't have.
I have the connection. I have the connection into IBM. So now I can, I need some, social media stuff. Can you do it for me? And that feeds through. So it's kind of like, the rebundling, right? I'm the one stop, but I'll have my people as freelancers, kind of, bringing in freelancer agencies or freelancer teams or people to do the work. And especially with, COVID hit, we saw a lot of that where the agency central kind of broke apart a little bit, and now they're working with people in Thailand and England and across the world, but still being involved with each other for that one project.
Teresa, can I add one other thing?
Different verticals.
I'm sorry, David. The one thing I wanted to add is that there are a lot of agencies that are best in class that partner up to pitch and manage business, white label or otherwise. And so that's been going on forever. And what will make that successful, or what has made that successful, is their ability to collaborate effectively. Yep. Something that, we as independents say holding companies aren't great at collaboration because they all have their separate profit centers. But the independents do a really great job of bringing in best in class, collaborating together, and helping clients solve the problems. So there's that will continue. But again, I'm seeing a lot of this collaboration and ownership all under one roof continuing to grow. But yes, collaboration is a really, really important point that independents need to really, really talk about, that they're really good at because they're entrepreneurial by nature. And it's something that holding company agencies just have not been as good at. Now, they'll argue they are, but again, when there's different profit centers, it becomes a bit of a dichotomy.
Right, that makes sense. Anything else to add there, David or Vince, on like, the structure or the competition aspect between holding companies and independent agencies?
I was going to ask Zach a question, and I'm seeing a ton of freelancers across the agency world today. Is there an added advantage where an agency can go in and pitch something and go, we have access to a plethora of freelancers around the world, so that you are getting the contributions of people outside of just North America? Have you run across that in the last year, Zach?
I think that the notion of freelancers is a short-term proposition. If you need help in certain departments, you bring freelance in behind the scenes. You don't want to really express to a prospect or a client that you rely heavily on freelancers. It shows that you don't have the team to manage it on your own. And freelancers aren't as invested in a business. They're just there for the project and they move on. So collaboration almost doesn't enter into the conversation. So freelance help is really a behind the scenes proposition, and it's not something you want to overtly serve up to a prospect, certainly. And you don't want clients to know you're relying on a lot of them, because they're just going to say, well, then who's doing the work? Why am I working with you if I can go out and find freelancers to do the same thing? So I think it's more of a behind the scenes function, if you will, especially on the tech side. Of course, I mean, I see agencies go to India and outside the U.S. for that kind of work because it's much less expensive. But again, that's all behind the scenes stuff that you could certainly do successfully.
Cool.
Right. Great. Well,
yeah, and I second that. That's what we see. It's purely internal. I just say that I see that as well. I would never tell the client, right? I'd say, yeah, we can do that. And I'm actually talking to 2 or 3 freelancers to get the work done that I've worked with and I'm happy with. And they're happy because they're sitting on the beach in Thailand.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
Tracy,
let's...
I'm sorry, do I have time for one other thought?
You do, yeah.
One of my insights coming out of these reviews is if it's a really large prospect and you're an agency that does not have an available client lead, don't smoke and mirror it. Don't bait and switch. Be honest about it. My biggest tip is that, let's say you're pitching a very, very large client and you're going to have to hire 20, 30 people.
Yep.
Well, I would bring in your head of talent, your chief people officer, HR, whoever does the hiring, put them in the pitch and tell them how you as an agency attract and hire better talent than anyone else. That's going to go a long way. Be very transparent about who you have on staff and who you don't. Do not smoke and mirror it, because clients will see right through it.
Right. And I was going to actually go right there, which is what happens when you actually win the business. So, where do and how do agencies manage the stress, and where does the stress start to show operationally within these agencies as you bring on a new big book of business that you've won, or even just an average size or a standard size client that you're bringing on? You start to see stress operationally. Just to kind of close things out, let's talk about, like, when you win the business, what are some other things an agency should do to set themselves up for success, set the brand up for success?
Well, if you want me to just jump in quickly, that's where freelance can help you as a bridge. But the minute you start missing deliverables, the pressure goes on the client lead, and then client service suffers because they're not delivering the expectations of the client. So freelance is a way to fill in those gaps, to make sure you deliver all that work on time, because that's the killer. If you're late on stuff, I mean, there's no excuse for that, and clients have no patience. So that's really, it's really important. So client service, again, is really everything, right? Managing that transition, having a really disciplined approach, collaborative with the client so they're part of that process, and to be very transparent when there's a hiccup.
Yep, makes sense. Vince, what do you think when you've seen agencies win business? It's all celebration at first, and then the work starts.
The lead team has got to make sure that the production people are in place, the account people are in place, any number of thousands of jobs are set up in place. Once again, I'm back to the software program in question as well by adding to Zach's point, the scheduling all has to happen in the system in question so that everyone can see where jobs are in the pipeline, where campaigns are in the pipeline. There's that funny phrase called billing. If we don't bill, we have no receivables. If we have no receivables, we have no cash. What I've run into this particular year before people have migrated onto one program is agencies using 4, 5, 6 programs. And when you win a piece of business, it just adds to the stress of taking on an account because you no longer are just managing on 5 software programs. You now have swallowed a great big Python, or a Python has swallowed a volleyball. And how are you going to get all this done on in 5 different programs? At least if you've got the team in question and everybody's speaking to each other in one singular program, that alone certainly reduces a significant amount of stress moving forward.
Sure. Yep. Makes sense. David, anything from you about managing new clients coming on, setting that infrastructure up?
Well, again, we would hope that you've actually tracked, in our system, it's kind of, I always say it's cradle to grave. So we have the new business and we're trying to pitch to win that. If we pitched it, we've actually had that in the system. And yep. While we're developing, what is the pitch and what are we doing? And then I can easily convert that into a project or a campaign and start moving that forward. I can always see it within what's in my pipeline. Do I need to bring more people in, that type of thing. So the workload in general is always sitting there. So I can see, can I handle, adding another 100 hours a week to my agency? Who do I get to do that, right?
Right.
So, and then of course, there's always the billing that's always associated with that. I think, again, we are agency-based, so we have it cradle to grave. Everything's in there. Again, we get it. There's other examples of it as well. But just having that in place so you can, see what's coming up, what's in the pipeline already, what's your workload so you don't lose your people, right? You can't work somebody 60 hours a week, for 7 months solid. You won't have them.
Yep. That's great. I know we have a number of attendees on the line. I want to make sure to give you guys the forum to ask some questions. If you've got questions, feel free to leave them in the Q&A box. I definitely want to make sure you have access to Zach and Vince to ask some questions about sort of the larger, new business development landscape here. So please feel free to drop some questions in there. Going back to what Zach was saying regarding anticipating a loss to get exposure in a new vertical, how much loss is reasonable?
Well, that's a loaded question, Grant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends on how you structure your compensation. If you could do a tiered approach and maybe make it up in year 2, then it's kind of a no-brainer. If you put an incentive clause that will give you the opportunity on the back end of that first year to make some money, to make you whole, that's another rationale to take a loss out the gate. Typically, if you have to forego your profit year 1, many agencies do that. I remember pitching an automotive client. It was a $500 million client. The winning agency at the time said, we won't take a profit year 1, 0 profit. And they won the business, which is sad because, it's a race to the bottom and you don't want that. You don't want your competition lowering their fee just to get the business because it just lowers everything and it just makes it harder to dig out. So I would say foregoing year 1 profit is as low as you should go, if at all.
Vince, any advice there from a P&L perspective?
I can't say that all bets are on as of the fall of 2022. It's a slow challenge because you want to put your best foot forward, and you also want that piece of business. And so what I often recommend is that each agency every year budgets for a specific dollar amount of investment, whether they want to spend $250, $300, $400, $500,000 a year in new business. And it is very much themselves policing themselves from a new business standpoint. But to manage that, there's that whole ROI conversation to say, we just spent $100,000 on a piece of business that we won for $50 million, and the upside is that we might make $7.5 million on this thing. Sure, we would give up a percentage of the profit just to hold on to that. I would certainly be more aware of the thinking from a long-term perspective of the client. The minute you set some kind of a marker, it's not the easiest thing to get off that marker from the client's perspective. And discounting, I find, is never appreciated or even with any level of gratitude on the client side. Once you've discounted yourself accordingly, the expectation the following year is the same discount. And why did you take that away from me this year or next year? So, and I hear where Zach is coming from. If the agency is whole outside of that piece of business and can withstand a break-even situation and go, well, we're making 15 points now. Next year, we're going to make 15 points with this massive piece of business. Fine. If we are going to take this piece of business on and we are not necessarily in the best position to be able to afford that, we got to think long and hard about jumping into a situation like that.
Makes
so
sense.
There's my comment.
Teresa, just one other point about fees and all that is if you're an integrated agency, you look at your fee structure for both creative and media, and you may take a loss on one side to try to make it up on the other.
Sure.
That's a common tactic.
Sure. Yep. Well, we are at time now, so I think we're going to try to wrap. I want to make sure that, David, I think we'll maybe make sure that this is available, but then also make sure that folks on the line and also those who maybe were not able to attend live have access to Zach and Vince to get some more insight into your advice for their particular challenges or agency. What you guys do is super fascinating on the agency side, and frankly is needed now more than ever. So hats off to you guys for creating a business where it was absolutely needed. So this is great. This has been fantastic.
Thank you, Teresa, for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
Okay.